The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old construction worker from Birmingham who had never imagined he would one day wear the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard. His journey to this moment had been anything but ordinary, shaped by circumstances that would soon prove crucial to handling one of the most challenging situations any guard had ever faced. Marcus had grown up in a rough neighborhood where respect was earned through strength and violence was often the first language spoken. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was just 7 years old, leaving his mother Sarah to raise 3 children on her own while working double shifts at a local factory. Money was always tight, and Marcus learned early that life rarely offered second chances or easy paths forward. As a teenager, Marcus found himself walking a dangerous line between right and wrong. The local gangs offered easy money and a sense of belonging that his broken home couldn't provide. He spent countless nights on street corners, watching deals go down and violence erupt over territory disputes. More than once, he came close to crossing lines that would have changed his life forever. But something always held him back, perhaps his mother's unwavering belief that he could be better than his circumstances. The turning point came when Marcus was 19 and witnessed a brutal attack on an elderly man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. 3 gang members had cornered the man in an alley, demanding money he didn't have. Marcus watched from across the street as they beat the defenseless victim, and something inside him snapped. Without thinking of the consequences, he rushed across the road and confronted the attackers. The fight was brief, but intense. Marcus had learned to defend himself on the streets, but, more importantly, he had learned to control his anger and use it purposefully. He managed to drive off the attackers and help the injured man to safety. The elderly gentleman turned out to be a retired Army sergeant named William Hayes, who would become the most influential person in Marcus's life. William saw something in the young man that Marcus couldn't see in himself. Over the following months, the old soldier became a mentor and father figure, sharing stories of military service and the honor that came with protecting others. He spoke of discipline, duty, and the transformation that military training could bring to a young man's life. Most importantly, he helped Marcus understand that his troubled past didn't have to define his future. Encouraged by William's guidance, Marcus decided to enlist in the British Army at the age of 21. The decision wasn't easy, as it meant leaving behind everything he had ever known. His mother was worried, but proud, understanding that this might be her son's best chance at building a meaningful life. His siblings were supportive, even though they would miss having him around to help with family responsibilities. Basic training was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The physical challenges were demanding, but the mental transformation was even more profound. For the first time in his life, he was part of something larger than himself, surrounded by people who shared common goals and values. The drill sergeants were tough, but fair, pushing every recruit to discover strength they never knew they possessed. Marcus excelled in his training, showing natural leadership abilities and an unwavering commitment to his fellow soldiers. His street-smart background actually served him well, as he could read people and situations quickly, anticipating problems before they developed. He learned to channel his protective instincts in positive ways, becoming someone his unit could depend on in difficult situations. After completing basic training, Marcus was selected for specialized training with the Grenadier Guards, one of the most prestigious units in the British Army. The selection process was rigorous, testing not only physical capabilities but also mental resilience and character. Only a small percentage of applicants were accepted, and Marcus felt honored to be among them. The training for the Grenadier Guards was intense and comprehensive. Marcus learned about the unit's proud history, dating back over 3 centuries, and the important role they played in protecting the royal family and important state functions. He studied protocol, ceremony, and the exact standards expected of every guard. Every movement had to be precise, every uniform detail perfect, and every reaction measured and appropriate. One aspect of the training that particularly resonated with Marcus was learning about emotional control and professional composure. The instructors explained that guards would face numerous challenges while on duty, from unruly tourists to protesters and various forms of provocation. The ability to remain calm and professional under pressure wasn't just preferred, it was absolutely essential to the role. Marcus discovered that his difficult childhood had actually prepared him well for this aspect of the job. Growing up in a volatile environment had taught him to read situations quickly and remain calm when others around him lost control. He had learned to think before reacting and to consider the consequences of his actions. These skills, combined with his military training, made him exceptionally well-suited for the unique demands of serving as a Queen's Guard. During his first year of service, Marcus proved himself repeatedly in various situations. He served with distinction during several state ceremonies and royal events, earning praise from his commanding officers for his professionalism and attention to detail. His fellow guards respected him not only for his abilities, but also for his willingness to help younger or struggling members of the unit. Marcus also continued his education during his military service, taking advantage of training opportunities and working toward qualifications that would serve him well in civilian life. He studied conflict resolution, crowd management, and communication skills. The Army provided structure and purpose that had been missing from his earlier life, and he embraced every opportunity to grow and improve. As he prepared for what would become one of the most challenging days of his career, Marcus reflected on how far he had come from those dangerous streets in Birmingham. He thought about his mother, who now spoke with pride about her son, the Queen's Guard. He remembered William Hayes, who had passed away the previous year, but whose lessons about honor and service continued to guide Marcus every day. The morning of the incident started like any other duty day. Marcus went through his careful routine of preparing his uniform, ensuring every button was polished and every crease was sharp. The bearskin hat, weighing nearly 2 pounds, sat perfectly on his head. His red tunic was immaculate, and his black boots reflected the morning light like mirrors. Every detail had to be perfect because representing the crown meant accepting nothing less than the highest standards. As he took his position outside Buckingham Palace, Marcus could see the crowds already beginning to gather. Tourists from around the world came to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony, and managing their behavior was always a delicate balance. Most visitors were respectful and fascinated by the tradition, but there were always a few who seemed determined to test the guard's composure. Standing at attention, Marcus could hear the excited chatter of visitors in dozens of different languages. Children pointed and whispered, clearly amazed by the sight of the motionless guards in their traditional uniforms. Parents snapped photos and tried to explain the significance of what they were seeing. The atmosphere was generally positive and filled with curiosity about British traditions and history. However, Marcus's trained eye quickly picked out potential trouble in the crowd. There was a group of young men who seemed more interested in causing disruption than observing the ceremony. They were loud, appeared to have been drinking despite the early hour, and were making inappropriate comments about the guards and the royal family. Marcus mentally noted their position and behavior, remaining alert while maintaining his rigid stance. The group's behavior gradually escalated as they realized the guards wouldn't respond to their provocations. They began making increasingly offensive comments and gestures, testing the boundaries of what they could get away with. Other tourists started to look uncomfortable and moved away from the disruptive group, but the young men seemed encouraged by the attention they were generating. Marcus had dealt with similar situations before and knew that the best approach was usually to ignore the provocation completely. The guards' training emphasized that maintaining dignity and composure was more important than responding to individual acts of disrespect. Most troublemakers eventually got bored and moved on when they realized they couldn't get a reaction from the stoic guards. But this group was different. Their behavior continued to escalate, and it became clear that they were determined to push things as far as possible. The ringleader, a man in his early 20s with an aggressive demeanor and slurred speech, began approaching Marcus's position more closely. His friends followed, laughing and encouraging what was clearly going to be a serious confrontation. Marcus remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Inside, however, he was carefully assessing the situation and preparing for whatever might come next. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but his street background had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to turn dangerous. The crowd began to sense that something was building. Other tourists stopped their conversations and turned to watch what was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people began reaching for their phones to record what they suspected might become a memorable incident. The atmosphere shifted from casual observation to tense anticipation. What happened next would test every lesson Marcus had learned about self-control, professional duty, and human dignity. The young man stepped directly in front of Marcus, close enough that his breath was noticeable, and began hurling personal insults and derogatory comments about the guard, the military, and the royal family. His voice grew louder and more aggressive, clearly intended to provoke some kind of reaction. Marcus continued to stare straight ahead, his expression unchanged and his posture perfect. Years of training and life experience had prepared him for this moment, though he couldn't have imagined just how far the confrontation was about to go. The crowd watched in fascination as the immovable guard faced off against the increasingly agitated tourist, not knowing that they were about to witness something that would challenge everyone's understanding of strength, dignity, and human character. The tension in the courtyard continued to build as the confrontational tourist pressed closer to Marcus's position. The young man, whose name was later revealed to be Derek Hoffman, a 23-year-old from Germany who was visiting London with a group of university friends, had clearly consumed too much alcohol the night before and was now channeling his hangover frustration toward the nearest authority figure he could find. Derek's friends stood behind him, some laughing nervously while others seemed uncomfortable with how far their companion was pushing the situation. They had started the morning as a typical group of young travelers, excited to explore London's famous landmarks and capture social media content to share with friends back home. None of them had anticipated that their morning would spiral into such a tense confrontation. The group had spent the previous evening pub crawling through central London, celebrating the end of their final university exams. Derek, who studied business management at a prestigious German university, had always been the most outgoing and sometimes reckless member of his friend group. His behavior often bordered on arrogant, especially when alcohol was involved, and his friends had learned to manage his more challenging moments during their travels. Derek came from a wealthy family and had rarely faced serious consequences for his actions. His father owned a successful manufacturing company, and Derek had grown up with privileges that shielded him from understanding how his behavior affected others. He had developed a sense of entitlement that made him believe he could push boundaries without facing real repercussions. Standing before the motionless guard, Derek felt frustrated by the complete lack of response to his increasingly aggressive provocations. In his mind, everyone should acknowledge his presence and react to his demands for attention. The guard's professional composure was not admirable discipline to Derek. It was a personal challenge that needed to be overcome. Marcus, meanwhile, drew upon every technique he had learned for maintaining composure under pressure. He focused on his breathing, keeping it steady and controlled despite his heart rate increasing slightly in response to the confrontation. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, but his peripheral vision tracked Derek's movements and those of his friends. The crowd watching the scene had grown larger as word spread that something unusual was happening at the palace. Tourists who had been exploring other areas were drawn by the commotion, and local workers on their way to jobs stopped to observe what was developing. Many people began recording with their phones, sensing that they might be witnessing something significant. Among the observers was Janet Morrison, a retired teacher from Scotland who had come to London to visit her daughter. Janet had taught in challenging schools for over 30 years and had developed a keen eye for reading situations involving young people. She immediately recognized that Derek was operating from a place of entitled anger and that the situation was likely to escalate further. Also watching was Ahmed Hassan, a young father visiting with his 6-year-old son Omar. Ahmed worked as a social worker in Manchester and understood the dynamics of confrontation and de-escalation. He positioned himself to shield his son from whatever might happen while staying close enough to intervene if the situation became dangerous for bystanders. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a psychologist visiting from Canada, observed the interaction with professional interest. She could see the classic signs of someone trying to assert dominance through intimidation and recognized that the guard's refusal to engage was actually the most psychologically sound response to the provocation. Derek's frustration reached a boiling point as his verbal attacks failed to generate any response from Marcus. In his alcohol-affected judgment, he decided that more dramatic action was required to break through the guard's composure. Without warning, he gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly into Marcus's face. The act of spitting struck Marcus just below his left eye, running down his cheek toward his jaw. The substance was warm and humiliating, intended to degrade and provoke. For a split second, the entire courtyard fell silent as witnesses processed what had just happened. The audacity and disrespect of the action shocked even Derek's friends, who stepped back in alarm. In that moment, Marcus felt every instinct he had developed during his difficult childhood surge through his body. His street background screamed at him to retaliate immediately and decisively. The disrespect was profound and public, and every fiber of his being wanted to respond with the kind of swift justice he had learned in Birmingham's harsh neighborhoods. But, alongside those primal instincts, Marcus heard the voice of William Hayes, his elderly mentor, reminding him about true strength and honor. He remembered countless hours of military training focused on self-control and professional conduct. He thought about what his uniform represented and the oath he had taken to serve with dignity regardless of personal provocation. Most powerfully, Marcus thought about his mother Sarah, who had worked so hard to give him opportunities for a better life. He imagined how proud she was when she told her co-workers about her son, the Queen's Guard. He considered how disappointed she would be if he threw away everything he had worked for in a moment of rage, no matter how justified that rage might seem. The seconds stretched as Marcus processed these competing impulses. The crowd held its breath, expecting an explosion of anger or at least some acknowledgement of the degrading assault. Instead, something remarkable happened that would be talked about and analyzed for years to come. Marcus slowly and deliberately reached into his pocket and withdrew a clean white handkerchief. With measured movements, he wiped the spittle from his face, maintaining perfect posture and never breaking his forward gaze. His expression remained completely neutral, showing neither anger nor humiliation. When he finished cleaning his face, he carefully folded the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket. The crowd erupted in whispers and murmurs of amazement. Many of the witnesses had expected violence or at least a verbal confrontation, but instead they had observed something they had never seen before: true dignity under the most degrading circumstances. The guard's response was so unexpected and powerful that it seemed to transform the entire dynamic of the situation. Derek stood frozen, clearly not having anticipated this reaction. He had expected anger, violence, or at least some acknowledgement of his action. Instead, he faced a man who had absorbed his worst behavior and responded with a composure that made Derek's actions look petty and childish by comparison. For the first time that morning, Derek began to understand that he had seriously misjudged both the situation and the person he was confronting. Janet Morrison felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched the guard's response. In her decades of teaching, she had seen many examples of young people learning to control their impulses, but she had rarely witnessed such a profound demonstration of maturity and self-control. She found herself thinking about the lessons she could share with her former students about true strength and character. Ahmed Hassan instinctively pulled his son closer, using the moment as an unexpected teaching opportunity. He whispered to Omar about how the guard had shown real courage by choosing not to fight, explaining that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is remain calm when others try to make them angry. The little boy nodded solemnly, clearly impressed by what he had witnessed. Dr. Chun observed the psychological dynamics with fascination. Derek's aggressive behavior had been designed to establish dominance and control, but the guard's response had completely reversed the power dynamic. By refusing to engage on Derek's terms, Marcus had demonstrated a form of strength that was far more impressive than any physical retaliation could have been. Several police officers who had been monitoring the situation from a distance began moving closer, recognizing that Derek's behavior had crossed legal boundaries. Spitting on someone constituted assault under British law, and his actions in front of a royal residence made the offense even more serious. However, they also paused to observe how the situation might resolve itself, impressed by the guard's professional handling of the provocation. Derek's friends began urging him to leave immediately, finally, understanding that their companion had gone too far. They could see police officers approaching and realized that Derek's actions could have serious legal consequences. More importantly, they were beginning to feel genuine shame about their association with Derek's behavior and its reflection on them as visitors to the country. The broader crowd began to shift as well. Initial curiosity was replaced by a mixture of admiration for the guard and disgust for Derek's actions. Several tourists began expressing verbal support for Marcus, praising his professionalism and restraint. Others directed angry comments toward Derek, making it clear that his behavior was unacceptable and embarrassing. Marcus continued to stand perfectly still, but internally he was processing the profound significance of the moment. He realized that his response had transcended a simple matter of military discipline. It had become a statement about character, dignity, and the power of choosing how to respond to hatred and disrespect. He thought about all the people who had shaped his journey to this moment. His mother's unwavering love despite difficult circumstances. William Hayes's lessons about honor and service. His drill sergeant's emphasis on self-control under pressure. His fellow guards who had become like brothers, supporting each other through challenging assignments. Most importantly, Marcus recognized that his response had been watched and recorded by dozens of people who would carry the memory of this moment forward. Children in the crowd had seen an example of how to handle bullying and aggression. Adults had witnessed a demonstration of principles being maintained under extreme pressure. The story would be shared and retold, potentially inspiring others to choose dignity over retaliation in their own difficult moments. The immediate aftermath of the incident would bring investigations, interviews, and widespread media attention. Derek would face legal consequences for his actions, while Marcus would receive recognition for his extraordinary professionalism. But, in the moment itself, standing in that courtyard with spit still drying on his face, Marcus simply continued to serve with honor, embodying the highest ideals of his uniform and his character. As the situation continued to develop, it became clear that this single moment of choice, Derek's decision to assault and Marcus's decision to respond with dignity, would have far-reaching consequences that none of the participants could have anticipated. The power of social media would soon carry the story around the world, turning a brief confrontation into a global conversation about respect, character, and the true meaning of strength. As the immediate shock of Derek's assault began to settle, the courtyard atmosphere shifted dramatically. The police officers who had been approaching reached Derek's position and began questioning him about his actions. Their approach was professional but firm, making it clear that spitting on anyone, particularly a member of the Queen's Guard, was a serious offense that would have legal consequences. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams, who had been assigned to palace security that day, took the lead in addressing the situation. She was a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police with extensive experience in managing high-profile incidents. Sarah had seen many confrontations between tourists and guards, but the severity of Derek's assault and the remarkable dignity of Marcus's response made this case particularly significant. Derek's demeanor changed instantly when confronted by law enforcement. The arrogant confidence that had driven his aggressive behavior evaporated as he began to understand the real consequences of his actions. His friends surrounded him, speaking in rapid German and clearly trying to convince him to cooperate and apologize. The reality of potentially facing criminal charges in a foreign country was beginning to penetrate his alcohol-clouded judgment. Meanwhile, the crowd of witnesses continued to grow as news of the incident spread through social media. Several people had captured the assault and Marcus's response on video, and the footage was already being shared across various platforms. The hashtag #RoyalGuardRespect began trending as people expressed their admiration for Marcus's professionalism and their disgust for Derek's behavior. Among the crowd was Maria Santos, a journalist from Spain who had been in London covering a different story for her newspaper. She immediately recognized the significance of what had occurred and began interviewing witnesses to understand the full context of the incident. Her background as an investigative reporter had taught her to look beyond surface events to understand the deeper human stories involved. Maria approached Janet Morrison, the retired Scottish teacher who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Janet spoke passionately about the guard's extraordinary self-control and what his response revealed about his character. She compared it to the best examples of maturity and dignity she had observed in her decades of working with young people. Ahmed Hassan, the social worker visiting with his young son, shared his perspective on how the incident could serve as a teaching moment about conflict resolution and personal strength. He explained how he had used the guard's response to help his son understand that true courage often involves choosing not to fight rather than responding with aggression. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, the Canadian psychologist, provided professional insight into the psychological dynamics of the confrontation. She explained how Derek's behavior represented a classic attempt to establish dominance through humiliation, and how Marcus's response had completely subverted that dynamic by refusing to engage on Derek's terms. As Maria gathered these interviews, she began to understand that the incident represented something much larger than a simple confrontation between a tourist and a guard. It had become a powerful example of how individuals can choose dignity over revenge, professionalism over personal satisfaction, and service over self-interest. Detective Inspector Williams continued her investigation by interviewing Marcus, who was temporarily relieved from his post to provide his account of the events. Marcus spoke quietly and factually about what had occurred, showing no anger or desire for revenge. His focus remained on ensuring that the incident was handled properly and that the dignity of his position was maintained. When asked about his emotional response to the assault, Marcus explained that his training had prepared him for various forms of provocation, but that his personal background had given him perspective on what truly mattered. He spoke about growing up in an environment where violence was often the default response to disrespect, and how his military service had taught him that genuine strength came from self-control rather than retaliation. Marcus also expressed concern for Derek, recognizing that the young man's actions were likely driven by alcohol and poor judgment rather than genuine malice. He hoped that the consequences Derek would face might serve as a learning experience rather than simply punishment, and he emphasized that he bore no personal animosity toward his attacker. The detective inspector was impressed by Marcus's maturity and grace in handling the interview. In her years of law enforcement, she had rarely encountered someone who had absorbed such a personal assault with such dignity. She made detailed notes about Marcus's character and response, understanding that they would be important factors in how the case proceeded. Meanwhile, Derek was being processed through the initial stages of the criminal justice system. The charges he faced included assault, disturbing the peace, and behavior likely to cause public disorder. His friends had contacted their university and Derek's family in Germany, setting in motion a complex international response to the incident. Derek's father, Heinrich Hoffmann, was a successful businessman who had always been able to smooth over his son's previous difficulties through his financial resources and connections. However, the international nature of this incident and its growing media attention made it clear that money and influence would not be sufficient to make the problem disappear. Heinrich immediately flew to London with the family's lawyer, determined to minimize the damage to Derek's future prospects. He was accustomed to viewing problems as obstacles to be overcome rather than lessons to be learned, and his initial focus was on protecting Derek from consequences rather than helping him understand the significance of his actions. The lawyer, Klaus Weber, was experienced in international legal matters, but quickly realized that this case would be challenging. The clear video evidence of Derek's assault, combined with multiple witness testimonies and the high-profile nature of the victim, made defending Derek's actions nearly impossible. The best strategy would be to emphasize Derek's youth and inexperience while seeking to minimize the legal penalties. Back at Buckingham Palace, word of the incident had reached Marcus's commanding officers and higher levels of military leadership. Colonel James Pemberton, who commanded the Grenadier Guards Regiment, was particularly interested in understanding exactly how Marcus had handled the situation. The colonel had served for over 25 years and had never seen such a clear example of the values and discipline he tried to instill in his soldiers. Colonel Pemberton met privately with Marcus to discuss the incident and its aftermath. He expressed his pride in Marcus's response and emphasized that his actions had brought honor to the entire regiment. The colonel also wanted to ensure that Marcus understood he had the full support of his command structure and that his response was being viewed as an exemplary demonstration of military professionalism. During their conversation, Marcus spoke openly about the internal struggle he had experienced during the assault. He described the competing impulses he had felt and how his training and personal values had ultimately guided his response. The colonel was impressed by Marcus's self-awareness and his ability to make the right choice under extreme pressure. The colonel also discussed the broader implications of the incident, explaining that Marcus's response had created an opportunity to demonstrate the highest ideals of military service to a global audience. The video footage and media coverage would reach millions of people, providing a powerful example of how professional soldiers conduct themselves under the most challenging circumstances. As news of the incident continued to spread, responses began pouring in from around the world. Military leaders from various countries expressed their admiration for Marcus's professionalism. Veterans organizations praised his response as an example of the values they had fought to defend. Educational institutions used the incident as a case study in conflict resolution and character development. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Marcus and criticism of Derek's behavior. The contrast between their actions had created a powerful narrative about respect, dignity, and personal responsibility. Many people shared their own stories of choosing restraint over retaliation, inspired by Marcus's example. However, the attention also brought challenges. Media outlets sought exclusive interviews with both Marcus and Derek. Tourist interest in witnessing the changing of the guard ceremony increased dramatically as people hoped to see the famous guard who had shown such remarkable composure. The palace security team had to adjust their procedures to manage the increased attention and maintain normal operations. Marcus found the media attention overwhelming and uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition for simply doing his job as he understood it. His commanding officers worked to protect him from excessive media demands while ensuring that his story could be shared in ways that honored his service and the values he represented. The incident also sparked broader conversations about tourist behavior at important cultural and historical sites. Travel organizations began discussing the need for better education about appropriate conduct when visiting places of significance in foreign countries. Some tour companies started including specific guidance about respecting local customs and authority figures. Educational experts saw the incident as a valuable teaching tool for discussing character, consequences, and cultural sensitivity. Schools around the world began using the video footage and witness accounts to facilitate discussions about bullying, respect for authority, and appropriate behavior in challenging situations. Psychologists and sociologists analyzed the incident as an example of how individuals from different backgrounds respond to stress and confrontation. Marcus's response was studied as a demonstration of emotional intelligence and self-regulation under extreme pressure. Derek's actions were examined as an example of how privilege and entitlement can lead to poor decision-making and harmful behavior. As the immediate aftermath of the incident continued to unfold, it became clear that the consequences would extend far beyond the criminal charges Derek would face. The confrontation had become a global conversation about values, respect, and the choices individuals make when tested by difficult circumstances. Marcus's dignified response had elevated what could have been a simple assault into a powerful lesson about character and service that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. 2 weeks after the incident, the legal proceedings against Derek Hoffman began in earnest at Westminster Magistrates Court. The case had attracted significant international attention, with media representatives from across Europe covering the proceedings. Derek sat in the dock looking considerably different from the arrogant young man who had assaulted Marcus. He appeared subdued, anxious, and, finally, beginning to grasp the magnitude of his actions. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Rebecca Hartwell, presented a straightforward case built on clear video evidence and multiple witness testimonies. The footage from several different angles showed Derek's unprovoked assault on Marcus with disturbing clarity. There was no question about what had occurred or who was responsible. Rebecca Hartwell was a seasoned prosecutor with 15 years of experience handling cases involving assaults on public servants. She understood that this case was about more than just the specific charges against Derek. It was about sending a message about respect for those who serve the public and protecting the dignity of important national institutions. During her opening statement, Prosecutor Hartwell emphasized the premeditated nature of Derek's actions and the profound disrespect they showed toward Marcus personally and the institution he represented. She pointed out that Derek had traveled to London as a guest of the United Kingdom and had repaid that hospitality with contempt and violence. The defense, led by Klaus Weber, faced the difficult task of arguing for leniency despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. Weber's strategy focused on Derek's youth, his lack of previous criminal history, and what he characterized as a momentary lapse in judgment exacerbated by alcohol consumption. He argued that Derek was fundamentally a good person who had made a terrible mistake and was now facing consequences far out of proportion to his actions. However, Weber's arguments were undermined by additional evidence that emerged during the investigation. Security camera footage from earlier that morning showed Derek and his friends engaging in increasingly disruptive behavior at multiple locations around London. Rather than a single moment of poor judgment, the evidence painted a picture of escalating entitlement and aggression that had culminated in the assault on Marcus. When Marcus was called to testify, his appearance in court created a powerful moment that would be remembered by everyone present. He entered wearing his dress uniform, maintaining the same perfect posture and dignified bearing that had characterized his response to Derek's assault. His testimony was delivered in a clear, measured voice that conveyed both strength and restraint. Marcus recounted the events factually and without emotion, focusing on what had occurred rather than his personal feelings about the incident. When asked about his response to the assault, he explained his training and his understanding of his duties as a Queen's Guard. He emphasized that maintaining composure under pressure was fundamental to his role, and that personal feelings could never be allowed to interfere with professional responsibilities. Perhaps most remarkably, when asked about what consequences Derek should face, Marcus expressed hope that the legal process would provide an opportunity for learning and growth rather than simply punishment. He acknowledged that Derek's actions had been wrong and harmful, but he maintained that people could change and improve if given proper guidance and support. The impact of Marcus's testimony on the courtroom was profound. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who had presided over thousands of cases during her career, later described it as one of the most impressive demonstrations of character and professionalism she had ever witnessed. Even Klaus Weber, Derek's defense attorney, privately admitted that Marcus's grace and dignity made defending his client's actions nearly impossible. When Derek was given the opportunity to speak on his own behalf, he delivered what appeared to be a genuine expression of remorse and shame. The weeks since the incident had provided time for reflection, and the young man who stood before the court seemed fundamentally changed from the arrogant tourist who had assaulted Marcus. Derek spoke about his privileged upbringing and acknowledged that he had never faced serious consequences for his behavior. He admitted that alcohol was not an excuse for his actions, and that he had chosen to assault Marcus out of frustration and entitlement. Most importantly, he expressed deep regret for the pain and humiliation he had caused to someone who had been serving his country with honor and dedication. Derek's statement included a direct apology to Marcus, though he acknowledged that words were insufficient to undo the harm he had caused. He spoke about the lessons he had learned from the experience and his commitment to making meaningful changes in his behavior and attitudes. He also expressed gratitude that Marcus had chosen to respond with dignity rather than violence, recognizing that a different response could have led to much more serious consequences. The victim impact statement prepared by Marcus was read to the court by Prosecutor Hartwell. In it, Marcus described the personal cost of Derek's actions, including the humiliation of being assaulted while serving his country and the ongoing stress of dealing with international media attention. However, the statement also expressed hope that the incident could serve as a positive example of choosing restraint over retaliation and professional duty over personal satisfaction. Several character witnesses testified on Derek's behalf, including university professors and family friends who described him as intelligent and generally well-behaved. However, their testimonies were somewhat undermined by their own admissions that Derek had always been pampered and protected from the consequences of his actions. More powerful were the character witnesses who spoke for Marcus. Colonel Pemberton testified about Marcus's exceptional service record and his transformation from a troubled young man into an exemplary soldier. William Hayes's widow, Margaret, spoke about her late husband's mentorship of Marcus and how proud William would have been of Marcus's response to the assault. Perhaps most moving was the testimony of Marcus's mother, Sarah Thompson. She spoke quietly but powerfully about her son's difficult childhood and his determination to build a better life through military service. She described the pride she felt in watching him grow into a man of principle and character, and her gratitude that he had chosen dignity over violence in response to Derek's assault. Sarah's testimony included details about Marcus's childhood that he had never shared publicly, including his early struggles with anger and his commitment to learning self-control. She credited the military with providing structure and purpose that had allowed Marcus to channel his strength in positive directions, and she emphasized how proud she was that he had honored his uniform and his values under the most challenging circumstances. The sentencing phase of the trial provided Judge Reynolds with an opportunity to address the broader significance of the case. She acknowledged that Derek's assault was serious and had caused real harm to Marcus personally and to the reputation of tourists in the United Kingdom. However, she also recognized that Derek appeared to have learned from his mistakes and was committed to making positive changes. Judge Reynolds sentenced Derek to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, along with 200 hours of community service and a substantial fine. The suspended sentence meant that Derek would avoid immediate imprisonment if he remained out of trouble during the 2-year period, but any further legal violations would result in serving the full sentence. More significantly, the judge required Derek to write a formal letter of apology to Marcus and to the British people, and to participate in educational programs about conflict resolution and cultural sensitivity. She also ordered Derek to make a charitable donation to organizations supporting military veterans, ensuring that his actions would result in some positive contribution to society. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Reynolds praised Marcus's extraordinary professionalism and self-control, describing his response as an example of the highest ideals of military service. She noted that Marcus's choice to respond with dignity rather than anger had transformed what could have been a simple assault into a powerful lesson about character and service. The judge also addressed the broader implications of the case, emphasizing the importance of respectful behavior toward those who serve the public and the responsibility of visitors to honor the customs and institutions of their host countries. She expressed hope that the case would encourage more thoughtful and respectful behavior from tourists around the world. Following the sentencing, Derek and his family held a brief press conference outside the courthouse. Derek read a prepared statement reiterating his remorse and his commitment to learning from his mistakes. His father, Heinrich Hoffmann, also spoke, acknowledging that he had failed to teach his son proper respect for others and accepting responsibility for Derek's sense of entitlement. The Hoffmann family announced that they would be establishing a scholarship fund for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to pursue military service, inspired by Marcus's example of personal transformation through dedication and discipline. While this gesture could not undo Derek's assault, it represented a meaningful attempt to create something positive from the incident. Marcus chose not to attend the press conference, maintaining his preference for privacy and his focus on returning to normal duties. However, through his commanding officer, he expressed appreciation for Derek's apparent sincerity and hoped that the young man would indeed learn and grow from the experience. The conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter of the story, but the broader impact of the incident was just beginning to be understood. Educational institutions, military organizations, and tourism boards around the world were incorporating the case into their training and awareness programs, ensuring that the lessons of Marcus's dignified response would continue to inspire and educate for years to come. 6 months after the incident that had transformed his life, Marcus Thompson stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace. But the world around him had changed in ways he could never have anticipated. The daily routine of serving as a Queen's Guard remained the same. The precise movements, the perfect uniform, the unwavering composure. But the significance of his role had taken on new dimensions that extended far beyond the palace grounds. The video of Derek's assault and Marcus's dignified response had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms. The footage had been shared, analyzed, and discussed in languages Marcus had never heard, reaching audiences in countries he had never imagined visiting. What had begun as a moment of choosing dignity over retaliation had evolved into a global symbol of professionalism, self-control, and the power of responding to hatred with grace. Educational institutions around the world had incorporated the incident into their curricula. Elementary schools used simplified versions of the story to teach children about bullying and appropriate responses to aggression. High schools analyzed the psychological dynamics of the confrontation in social studies and conflict resolution classes. Universities examined the case in courses on leadership, ethics, and cross-cultural communication. Military academies and training facilities had made Marcus's response a cornerstone of their instruction on professional conduct under pressure. The footage was shown to new recruits as an example of what it truly meant to serve with honor, regardless of personal provocation. Senior officers used the case to illustrate how individual actions could reflect on entire institutions and how maintaining standards under extreme circumstances was essential to military effectiveness. Corporate training programs began using the incident to teach employees about maintaining professionalism in challenging customer service situations. Healthcare workers studied Marcus's response as an example of how to remain compassionate and professional when dealing with difficult patients or family members. Even customer service representatives in call centers were shown the video as inspiration for maintaining composure when faced with aggressive or abusive customers. The tourism industry had been profoundly affected by the incident as well. Travel companies around the world revised their pre-departure briefings to include specific guidance about respectful behavior at cultural and historical sites. The case became a standard example of how inappropriate tourist behavior could have serious legal and personal consequences, helping to educate travelers about the importance of cultural sensitivity. Marcus himself had struggled with the global attention that resulted from his moment of choice. He was a private person by nature who had never sought recognition for simply doing his duty as he understood it. The constant media requests, social media mentions, and public recognition felt overwhelming and uncomfortable, particularly given his modest background and preference for serving quietly. However, With the guidance of his commanding officers and the support of his family and fellow guards, Marcus had gradually learned to accept that his response had transcended his personal intentions. Colonel Pemberton helped him understand that his actions had created opportunities to promote positive values and inspire others to choose dignity over revenge in their own challenging moments. Marcus began accepting carefully selected speaking engagements at military events and educational institutions. His appearances were always focused on the values of service, self-control, and professional excellence rather than on personal recognition. He consistently redirected attention from himself to the broader principles he represented and the importance of supporting military service members and public servants. During one particularly memorable appearance at a conference for educators, Marcus spoke about the role that mentors and teachers had played in his own transformation from a troubled young man to a professional soldier. He credited individuals like William Hayes and his military instructors with teaching him that true strength came from self-discipline rather than physical force, and he encouraged the educators to continue their vital work in shaping young people's character. Marcus also used these platforms to advocate for programs that provided opportunities for disadvantaged young people to find direction and purpose through military service. He spoke passionately about how the Army had given him structure, training, and a sense of belonging that had fundamentally changed the trajectory of his life. His personal story resonated powerfully with audiences who were working to help at-risk youth find positive paths forward. Meanwhile, Derek Hoffman had been working to rebuild his life and reputation in Germany. The suspended sentence and community service requirements had provided structure for his efforts to make amends for his actions. The educational programs ordered by the court had opened his eyes to the impact of privilege and entitlement on his behavior, and he had begun working with organizations focused on conflict resolution and cultural understanding. Derek's community service involved working with refugee organizations, helping new immigrants navigate German society and understand local customs and expectations. The irony was not lost on Derek that he was now on the other side of cultural education, helping vulnerable people avoid the kind of misunderstandings and conflicts that had led to his own legal troubles. The experience had been humbling and transformative for Derek. Working with people who had fled violence and persecution gave him perspective on real hardship and genuine courage. He began to understand that his assault on Marcus had not been an expression of strength, but rather a demonstration of weakness and insecurity masked by alcohol and bravado. Derek also began studying conflict resolution and mediation, inspired in part by Marcus's example of choosing restraint over retaliation. He discovered that he had natural abilities in helping people find common ground and resolve disputes peacefully. The skills he developed through his court-ordered education began to shape his career aspirations and his understanding of how he wanted to contribute to society. The scholarship fund established by the Hoffman family had grown significantly, providing opportunities for dozens of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to pursue military service or related careers in public service. Derek had become personally involved in the selection process, using his experience to identify candidates who showed potential for positive transformation through structure and guidance. One of the scholarship recipients was James Miller, a 17-year-old from Manchester whose background was remarkably similar to Marcus's childhood experiences. James had grown up in a single-parent household in a rough neighborhood and was struggling with anger and direction when he learned about the scholarship opportunity. Derek's personal mentorship and the financial support provided by the fund helped James pursue military training and begin building a more positive future. The connection between Derek and James represented one of the most meaningful outcomes of the entire incident. Derek's work with James and other scholarship recipients provided a concrete way for him to channel his remorse into positive action, while the young people benefited from guidance provided by someone who had learned difficult lessons about character and consequences. Marcus and Derek had maintained minimal but respectful contact following the conclusion of the legal proceedings. Derek had sent several letters expressing his ongoing remorse and describing his efforts to make positive contributions to society. Marcus had responded briefly but cordially, expressing hope that Derek would continue to grow and learn from the experience. When Derek requested a face-to-face meeting to deliver a personal apology, Marcus agreed, though he insisted that the meeting be private and not used for publicity purposes. They met at a quiet cafe in London, where Derek spoke candidly about his transformation and his gratitude that Marcus had chosen dignity over violence in response to the assault. Marcus listened carefully to Derek's words and was impressed by the apparent sincerity of his remorse and his commitment to positive change. He shared some of his own experiences with overcoming difficult circumstances and choosing better paths, emphasizing that people could indeed change if they were willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly and making different choices. The meeting concluded with both men expressing hope that their story would continue to inspire others to choose restraint over retaliation and growth over resentment. They agreed that the incident had become larger than either of them individually, and that their responsibility was to ensure it continued to promote positive values and constructive behavior. As Marcus returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace, he reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a moment of choosing dignity over anger. The global response to his actions had shown him that individual choices could have far-reaching consequences, and that maintaining principles under pressure could inspire others to act with similar courage and restraint. The daily routine of serving as a Queen's Guard continued unchanged, the same precise movements, the same perfect uniform, the same unwavering composure. But Marcus now understood that his service represented something larger than military duty alone. He had become a symbol of the power of choosing character over impulse, professionalism over personal satisfaction, and dignity over revenge. Standing at his post, watching the continuing stream of tourists who came to witness the changing of the guard, Marcus occasionally thought about the moment that had changed everything. He remained grateful that his training and values had guided him to respond with restraint rather than anger, and he continued to hope that his example would encourage others to make similar choices when faced with their own moments of testing. The legacy of that brief confrontation would continue to unfold for years to come, inspiring educators, military leaders, parents, and young people around the world. The story of the tourist who spat on a royal guard and the guard's calm reaction had become more than just an incident. It had become a powerful reminder that how we choose to respond to hatred and disrespect can define not only our own character but also inspire others to reach for higher standards of dignity and grace.